Did you know that millions of Christians are deceiving themselves every day? They believe they are seeking God, but without realizing it, they have turned prayer into a weak, lazy, and lifeless ritual. Most do it lying down, tired, mumbling quick phrases before drifting off to sleep. But does the Creator of the universe deserve this kind of prayer? I need to open my heart and share something I experienced, because I know many people go through the same thing. For a long time, I treated prayer as something automatic, almost unaware of how relaxed I was becoming before God. I would arrive at the end of the day tired, lie in bed, and with heavy eyes, murmur a few quick words before drifting off to sleep. I thought I was praying, that I was doing my duty, but in reality I was giving God only the crumbs of my time. It was as if I were saying, "Lord, take what's left of my day." But deep down, I didn't realize I was dishonoring the presence of the King of Kings. It was then that the Holy Spirit began to silently confront me. I remembered the men and women in the Bible who didn't just present themselves before God. Daniel, for example, knelt 3 times a day, even knowing that this simple act could cost him his life. He didn't hide, he didn't make excuses, but he understood that being before the Lord required reverence. And I, in my comfortable room, thought that lying down, tired and distracted, I was offering the same intensity. This began to weigh on me like a truth I could no longer ignore. In those early mornings of week prayers, I also remembered David. The Bible tells us that he would rise at midnight simply to thank the Lord. Think about it. He would interrupt his rest to raise his voice in gratitude. He was a man full of flaws, yes, but also full of reverence. Meanwhile, I would say, "God knows I'm tired, he knows my heart." But the reality was harsh. I was using that phrase as an excuse not to get up, not to make an effort, not to step out of my comfort zone. The strongest memory, however, was of Jesus in Gethsemane. He fell face down on the ground, praying so intensely that he sweated drops of blood. The Son of God, knowing he would face the cross, demonstrated that prayer requires total surrender. How could I look at this example and still think it was normal to pray lying down, almost asleep? The contrast was overwhelming. I felt small in the face of the greatness of it. It was as if a light had revealed, "You're not treating prayer with the seriousness it deserves." And there I understood a truth that changed my life. Posture matters. It's not just about the position of the body, but about what the body expresses from the heart. When we kneel, when we prostrate ourselves, when we raise our hands, the body pulls the heart closer to God. But lying down, relaxed, distracted, the body pulls the heart away. I realized that the enemy loves this. He loves it when we turn prayer into a lazy routine, because he knows that a weak prayer doesn't move heaven or threaten hell. At that moment, I wept silently. It was as if the Lord were asking me, "If you were going to speak to an important authority, would you lie down?" The answer was obvious, of course not. I would stand up, show respect, and strive to be awake and attentive. But with the Creator of the universe, I was going anyway. It was hard to admit, but it was the truth that broke me. Right then and there, still with tears in my eyes, I said, "Lord, forgive me. I didn't know. I treated you as if you were just anyone when you are worthy of everything." After that night, something began to shift within me. I could no longer close my eyes and simply repeat automatic words while lying in bed. It was as if the Holy Spirit had left a deep mark on my consciousness. Every time I tried to pray in a relaxed state, a gentle voice would remind me, "You're before the King of Kings. Is this how you want to present yourself?" This thought wouldn't leave me alone. I understood that it wasn't condemnation, but loving correction from a Father who wanted to teach me reverence. And that's when I began to realize that prayer isn't just talking to God. It's an audience with the Lord of the universe. I clearly remember one day when I was exhausted from work. All I wanted to do was throw myself on the bed and pass out. When I put my head on the pillow and thought about praying, that memory came flooding back. Daniel, on his knees, praying despite the death decree. I thought, he had every reason to give up, but he chose to honor God. And am I going to lie down and pray anyway? It burned inside me, bothering me to the point where I couldn't simply ignore it. It was then that, even though I was tired, I got up and knelt beside the bed. At first, it seemed like just a gesture. I was tired, my mind still scattered, and my words came out almost in a stutter. But suddenly, something changed. It felt like my heart was awakened just by being on my knees. The weight of the day began to lift, and God's presence filled that room in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I wept without realizing it, because I understood that this simple act had power. I was showing the Lord that he was worthy of my effort, that I wasn't just giving up leftovers. It was at that moment that another biblical memory came to mind. Hannah, mother of the prophet Samuel. She was so distressed that she couldn't even speak, only moving her lips before God. That touched me deeply. Hannah didn't care who was watching. She didn't care what she looked like. She poured herself out before the Lord. And I realized that this was what I was missing, pouring out my heart intensely, without fear, without laziness, without distraction. There, on my knees, I understood that prayer is not about the number of words, but about the total surrender of the soul. That early morning, I felt like Elijah on Mount Carmel. The Bible says he bowed down, put his face between his knees, and cried out for rain. It wasn't just a physical posture, it was a declaration of total dependence on God. I thought, if these men and women prostrated themselves, who am I to think I can talk to God any old way? The Lord's presence enveloped me, and I realized that even my body needed to be aligned with my soul for prayer to have meaning. It wasn't religiosity, it was reverence. When I finished that prayer, it felt like something had been broken inside me. It was as if a barrier had fallen and I could breathe again in the spiritual world. I wasn't just repeating words, I was experiencing a real encounter with God. I rose from my knees, certain that I had learned a lesson that would change my journey forever. The body awakens the heart, and the awakened heart moves heaven. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I was convinced that hell had also felt the weight of my prayer. After that night of confrontation, I realized that my biggest battle wasn't against physical fatigue, but against the spiritual laziness the enemy used to trap me. It was incredible how it seemed easier to spend hours on my phone watching television or even chatting about anything, but when it came time to pray, I suddenly fell asleep. I began to realize it wasn't a coincidence. The devil knew exactly when to distract me, and I, without realizing it, was giving in time after time. One scene struck me. I remember a night I stayed up late watching news and useless videos. When I finally decided to pray, my body felt like dead weight. I lay down and started talking to God, but soon I was almost asleep. Suddenly, a phrase cut through my mind. If this were an important meeting at work, would you be like this? It hurt, because it was true. How many times have I stayed up all night trying to finish tasks, but I only gave God a few minutes before drifting off. I got up and knelt, still embarrassed. It wasn't a pretty, wordy prayer. It was just a sincere cry. Lord, help me give you my best. And to my surprise, it seemed like every minute spent there in reverence was more valuable than the hours of distracted prayer I'd spent in the past. The weight of God's presence filled me in a simple but real way. I understood. It wasn't about talking a lot, but about showing respect and surrender. I also began to notice how posture influenced my heart. When I was lying down, relaxed, it seemed impossible to maintain attention. But when I bent my knees or stood up, even my mind aligned. I remembered how the prophets bowed, how ordinary people in the Bible tore their garments or threw themselves into the dust. It wasn't theater, it was a sign that the heart was engaged. And I began to feel it in my skin. My body was helping my soul draw closer to God. Over time, I noticed a practical difference. My prayers were no longer just quick requests, but rather encounters where I could pour out my heart. Sometimes I cried without being able to explain why. Other times, I just sat in silence, feeling peace invade my room. But one thing was always certain. God was there, listening to me, because I had decided to truly honor Him. And it was in this process that I realized a secret that changed my life. Prayer doesn't begin in the heart alone, but in the decision to break free from laziness, stand up, and choose to stand before God with reverence. This simple change in attitude began to rekindle something that had been extinguished within me. It was as if every time I bent my knees, I was also saying, Lord, I am here whole, not in a haphazard way. As the days went by, I began to realize how small choices determined the strength of my spiritual life. Before, I thought it was just a matter of to pray or not to pray, but God showed me it went deeper. It was about how I presented myself before Him. When I went haphazardly, lying down, distracted, the result was empty. But when I stood up and stood in a position of reverence, something different happened. It was as if the very environment around me changed. The room was no longer just a room, it became an altar. An experience marked this turning point. I'd had a difficult day, full of problems. My mind was tired, and I wanted to simply throw myself into bed. But this time, I decided, no, I won't repeat the same mistakes. I'm going to get up and truly seek God. I knelt beside the bed and began to pray. At first, the words were simple, almost powerless, but within a few minutes I felt an inexplicable peace wash over me. It was as if the weight of the day had been lifted, and I realized the posture that seemed merely physical was guiding my heart to the right place. It was that same night that God showed me something practical. I had an important meeting the next day, and I thought, if it were with my boss, I would prepare everything, get dressed, and be attentive. But with God, I often arrived relaxed, almost asleep. This comparison embarrassed me. I understood that it wasn't about religiosity or external rules, but about honor. I wouldn't treat any human authority with such carelessness, so why did I treat the Creator this way? I began applying this in other areas. I began setting aside a specific time to seek God before bed. Instead of waiting for fatigue to overwhelm me, I would shut out distractions and get up. I realized that when I prioritized the Lord, everything flowed differently. My mind opened, my words came alive, and even my tears took on a new weight. It wasn't a ritual, but a demonstration that He came first. And the result was immediate. Problems that previously kept me awake at night no longer dominated me in the same way. I felt clearer about making decisions, more strength to face the struggles of everyday life. It was as if the simple act of getting out of bed to pray had broken invisible chains. I realized that the enemy didn't just want to tire me out. He wanted to keep me trapped in superficial prayer, because he knew that intense prayer had the power to shake the spiritual world. At that point, it was no longer a question of should I or shouldn't I pray on my knees. It was a necessity. I felt the difference in my heart. The weariness of my body didn't disappear, but it was overcome by something greater. I understood that reverence isn't optional for those who love God. It's a natural response of those who recognize who they're before. And each time I knelt, I felt a stronger certainty. Heaven was moving and hell was trembling. It was then that I realized the change wasn't just happening in the moment of prayer, but throughout my life. I became more vigilant, more attentive to my surroundings. Before, I spent the whole day running around chasing things and only remembered God when I lay down to rest. Now, because of the decision to get up and get on my knees, I began and ended the day differently. It was as if prayer had stopped being a detail and became the center that organized everything else. One of the first things I noticed was a transformation in the way I dealt with worries. I'd always been anxious, always carrying the burden of everything working out on my shoulders. But when I learned to get out of bed to pray, it seemed like something changed. I no longer took my worries to bed. I left everything before God before I went to bed, and this even changed my sleep. Rest no longer came from physical exhaustion, but from the certainty that the Lord was taking care of every detail. Another powerful thing was realizing how my faith began to strengthen. And when I prayed lying down, everything seemed weak, distant, almost empty. But when I began to pray reverently, I realized that the answers came more clearly. It wasn't always an immediate miracle, but there was peace, direction, conviction. I better understood the yes, the no, and even the wait. It was as if my communication with heaven had been unlocked, as if God were saying, "Now you understand the seriousness of my presence." I also began to notice a difference in the spiritual atmosphere of my home. Before, there were days when I felt a strange heaviness, as if oppression were taking over. But when I began to pray on my knees, it seemed as if something changed in the air. It was as if the atmosphere were purified by God's presence. My home became a place of peace, and even the arguments that once arose easily began to subside. I understood that this wasn't just my own change, but a consequence of bringing God's presence more intensely. There was also an impact on my testimony to others. Before, I spoke about God superficially, but now I had more authority. Because I wasn't just repeating verses, I was living them. When someone asked me about faith or prayer, I didn't just pay lip service, but shared real experiences. People began to notice this difference and even approached me for prayer. I was amazed because God was using something that had previously been my weakness to become a source of life for others. The most incredible thing, however, was realizing how the enemy reacted. Because every time I stood up and bent my knees, it was as if I were taking away territory he had occupied in my life. I understood that praying lying down was comfortable for him because it kept me weakened. But when I decided to stand up and seek God with reverence, I entered into true spiritual warfare. And this not only changed my life, but made me realize that revival truly begins on my knees, and never on a lazy bed. Over time, I realized that God was using that simple change in posture to teach me much deeper lessons. It wasn't just about getting out of bed and kneeling. It was about understanding the seriousness of standing before him. I began to see that prayer wasn't a favor I was doing for God, but a privilege he was granting me. This realization changed everything. Every time I got on my knees, I felt as if I were entering an audience with the King. And this made me weigh every word that came out of my mouth. On several occasions, I would even begin to pray for something specific, but suddenly the Spirit would guide me to other matters. It was as if he were saying, "Francisco, it's not about what you want. It's about what you need to hear right now." This is how I received guidance I never would have understood on my own. Work situations, family problems, personal decisions. In everything, God began to speak clearly. It was as if each moment of prayer became an encounter of instruction and correction. One night in particular struck me. I was praying on my knees when I felt a powerful question in my heart. Would you give me the same effort if it were for someone else? That cut me to the quick. Because the truth is, I often spent more energy trying to please people than honoring God. I remembered how many times I'd rushed to meet deadlines, fulfill commitments, and not disappoint people, but with God, I always found excuses. It was then that I realized that prayer wasn't just a spiritual act, but a revelation of where my priorities truly lay. I also began to understand that the enemy isn't afraid of a believer who prays haphazardly. He doesn't fear words thrown to the wind, nor empty prayers. But when someone decides to truly seek God, with surrender, with reverence, then all hell breaks loose. I felt this in my spirit, sometimes even before praying. Thoughts of giving up, distractions, or even sudden sleepiness would come. It was a struggle. But precisely in those moments, when I resisted and got on my knees, were the most powerful prayers I ever prayed. And it was in this process that God began to teach me about spiritual authority. I realized that when I prayed lying down, weak, my own faith seemed small. But when I prayed on my knees, surrendering everything, it was as if my words carried a different weight. It wasn't because of me, but because I was in tune with God's heart. And this gave me a boldness I had never experienced before. I realized I could cry out not only for my life, but for my home, my family, my friends, and God answered. Upon finishing these prayers, I didn't just feel relieved, I felt strengthened. It was as if each moment of reverence was building a spiritual fortress within me. I understood that I wasn't just talking to God, I was being transformed by Him. And this transformation began with a simple decision: getting out of bed and kneeling. From that moment on, I never wanted to pray again, no matter what, because I understood the value of being on my knees before the Lord. As the weeks passed, I began to realize something I hadn't before. My spiritual life was under constant attack, and I didn't realize it because I was asleep. When I prayed lying down, distracted, the enemy kept me weak, blind, and lacking discernment. But when I began to bend my knees, it seemed God opened my eyes to understand the devil's strategies. I began to realize that the moments when I felt most tired, lazy, or unmotivated were precisely the times when I needed to pray the most. The devil didn't just want to distract me, he wanted to prevent me from accessing the power of fervent prayer. Once, after a particularly difficult day, I considered giving up on prayer that night. I was so tired I just wanted to sleep. But suddenly, a clear thought came to me. This is when you need to fight. I got up, knelt, and began to cry out. At first it was difficult. It felt like my mind was blocked. But I kept insisting. Little by little, I began to feel God's presence fill the room. Words I hadn't even planned began to come out of my mouth, and before I knew it, I was interceding for my family, asking for protection, crying out for deliverance. It was one of the most powerful moments of my prayer life. That night, I understood something precious. Prayer is not just a habit, it is a war. No one goes to war lying down, relaxed, distracted. A soldier stands, prepares, positions himself. I realized the same thing happens spiritually. When I knelt, I was saying to the enemy, I will not fight lying down, I will fight with reverence because I know my Lord is with me. This simple change in posture gave me courage. I understood that the power was not in me, but in the God who answers a prayer made with faith and surrender. I also began to notice how the enemy tried to counterattack. There were days when sleepiness came more strongly than ever, or distractions appeared out of nowhere. Sometimes even good things appeared, but always at the time I had set aside to pray. It was as if everything conspired to keep me from that meeting. But instead of intimidating me, this only confirmed that I was on the right path. If the enemy was fighting so hard against my prayers, it was because they were having an effect. It was during this process that my faith gained strength. I no longer prayed simply for things, but positioned myself in authority. I declared protection over my home, peace over my mind, life over areas that had been dry. And I saw results. Doors that had been closed began to open. Situations that seemed hopeless began to change. It wasn't magic. It was a consequence of the decision not to surrender to spiritual laziness. Each time I bent my knee, I felt I was taking back territory the enemy had stolen. This realization changed everything for me. Prayer was no longer a burdensome obligation, but a powerful weapon. I knew that lying down, the enemy laughed at my weakness, but kneeling, he trembled before the power of God working through me, and this became my greatest motivation. Because I realized that every time I chose to stand and kneel, it wasn't just me praying, it was heaven moving with me. Over time, I began to notice that the transformation wasn't just between me and God. My family noticed the difference. Before, I was impatient, easily angered, and often wanted to solve things with force. But after I started taking everything on my knees, even my attitude changed. There was more calm in my words, more firmness in my decisions, and a peace I hadn't known before. People asked what had happened to me, and I could only reply, I learned to treat prayer with the reverence God deserves. At work, there was also an impact. Situations that previously made me anxious began to be resolved in unexpected ways. I realized that when I sought God intensely, He gave me wisdom to deal with problems. It wasn't that everything became easy, but I had clarity to act. It was as if praying on my knees gave me practical guidance for life's challenges. And when I shared this with colleagues, some remained silent, others asked for advice, and some even asked me for prayer. One of the most powerful experiences was when someone close to me asked me for help. She was going through spiritual struggles, feeling constant oppression, and didn't know what to do. Previously, I would have simply said, "I'll pray for you," and said a quick prayer. But now I understood I needed to take a stand. I went to my room, knelt, and cried out for her life. As I prayed, I felt as if chains were being broken. The next day, this person told me she felt relief, as if a weight had been lifted off her. It was then that I confirmed it. Reverent prayer has real power. I also learned that the enemy never gives up trying to lull us back into a weak routine. He always tries to push me to bed, always whispers thoughts of tiredness, always tries to make prayer seem like something heavy. But now I know the truth. He fears when a child of God bends their knees. He knows that at that moment, heaven moves. And that's why he fights so hard to keep us distracted. I understood that praying lying down isn't just a matter of a posture. It's opening up gaps so that my spiritual life becomes weak and powerless. Today, I no longer see prayer as I once did. It's not about a quantity of words or formulas, but about surrender. And surrender begins when I recognize that the Lord deserves my best, not leftovers. When I choose to get out of bed, shut out distractions, and bend my knees, I'm saying, "You are worthy, Lord, of my attention, my effort, my priority." And his answer never fails. Whenever I position myself this way, I feel God's presence fill the room, bringing peace, strength, and direction. And that's why I leave this warning. Don't treat prayer as something small. Revival doesn't begin in a lazy bed, but on bended knees. Praying while lying down may seem comfortable, but it doesn't generate life. Prayer on your knees, with reverence and surrender, moves heaven and makes hell tremble. So choose today. Will you continue offering crumbs, or will you get up and give God your best? Because I've learned firsthand, when the body bends, the heart awakens, and all heaven bends to listen. If this word resonated with you, don't stay silent. Write in the comments, "I choose to pray on my knees." Let's fill this video with declarations of reverence and faith. Also, share it with at least 3 people you know who need to hear this, because the enemy wants to keep millions asleep. But today, the truth is being exposed.